This is a session on module 5, which is basically we'll be talking about RNN and LSTM. So there are, I mean, in NLP, we have so many modules which are, I mean, important to understand. So all of them may not be useful in practical scenarios, but it's always good to have a better understanding of these basic NLP modules. So it will help us, build models which are really helpful in real-time scenarios. Okay. So with that note, LSTM and RNN is uh, a very well-known module by now in NLP domain. And if we try to understand what exactly these models are, let's go by the topics I'm going to discuss on this session. So the table of contents for this session would be a basic understanding of RNN and LSTM networks. We will talk about the vanishing gradient problem, which RNN could not actually cope up with. I mean, RNN has this problem. So we introduce LSTM architecture and the advantages of LSTM, and we'll see each implementation with a code module, and we will see the how we can proceed with those implementations. Okay. So let's understand LSTM and RNN. uh, for example, let's say if you consider a few things, like if I say self-stat study we AI act, doesn't make any sense, right, to us. It's just a kind of, I mean, it doesn't have any meaning. It doesn't look like a sentence to human beings. So let's say if I rephrase that again as self-stat will study AI, so that completely understandable and making sense. So if some sentences like this, self-stat study AI at the first sentence doesn't make sense to us, how it is going to make sense to a machine, right? So that's a uh, I mean, that's a very basic and primary question that we should be asking before we dive into neural networks, and before we dive into RNN or LSTM structures. So a very basic and uh, you know uh, a low level understanding of how NLP, I mean, or these models uses textual data to process like humans, right? So ultimately, our goal is to make machines understand like humans, talk like humans, or read like humans, and write like humans, right? So that would be our goal as a problem solving expert in NLP. So with that that kind of approach, uh, if we notice, everything makes sense when there is a sequence, right? In NLP or in textual data, if there is no sequence, it is not going to make any sense to us. So we struggle otherwise, and so on. So far in a neural network machine. So it's same for a machine and a human. Now probably to Okay, so that's kind of a very basic problem that we introduce. So and we are going to solve that problem using RNN or LSTM. Okay, so why RNN or LSTM? First question that might come: why not any other model? So one thing that comes into picture with RNN is every day we do multiple complex tasks, right? Such as, let's say, I'm taking an example, being a human, right? So what we do, we probably we read and read a newspaper, we listen to So now, as we understand uh, the human nature, right, to understand things like newspaper reading or listening to someone, or even remembering things that happened in the morning or afternoon and or in a sequence in evening, right? So this is very easy for us to know or understand things because they are in a sequence. So as the things are happening in a sequence, we get the meaning, we get the understanding. So a complete sequence of information determines the next next event or a complete event, right? So in a time series data, let's say time defines the occurrence of events. In a genome sequence, right, where every sequence has different meaning. So in a genome sequence, those sequences actually defines what exactly that's going to do, right? So here comes the need of neural network which can capture some prior knowledge about the data. So we use a neural network for capturing prior knowledge about the data, so we can understand the context that whatever said or happened at timestamp t, let's say 9 o'clock, you heard that there will be a lockdown, right? So based on that, you understand at 10 a.m. that I could not go out. So the meaning of okay, so this is something that where we actually take the input and we understand the point, right? So let's say any newspaper reading or listening to someone keep track of time or remembering things that happened in the morning, afternoon, and this so on, right? That's what I was talking about. And a complete sequence of information determines the next event, right? So here comes the need of neural network which can capture some prior knowledge about the data. So to capture the prior knowledge is very important to understand here, because without prior knowledge we would not get the context or the event that happened, right? Just like we know for this example, we know that we were in the previous slide we understanding what exactly RNN is, and how it actually helps in NLP, right? So based on that you understand why RNN is required. So similarly there is a context behind any event that happened before and the next. So another thing that with recurrent neural network and LSTM are a kind of neural network that specializes in processing sequences, and they are useful because they let us have variable length sequences. So it can have one, two, or uh, uh, many kind of relationships, like say one to one or one to many, many to one, right? So many to many, these kind of network we can build. So let's say one input, we can have multiple outputs. We can have one input, one output, right? And we can have multiple inputs and one output. So this is a very big advantage of using RNN, which take variable length sequences, which take I mean they take as an input or output, gives variable length sequence. Okay, so why RNN or LSTM? We use for multiple purposes in natural language processing. So like say text classification is one of the important tasks that we do in NLP. For example, let's say when we do spam filtering in one type of text classification, it classifies emails or some other type of text such as web pages into two categories like spam or not spam. So if something is spam or not, we can identify using text classification. Basically, we are classifying a text as spam or not. Similarly, we can read the Twitter data and Twitter tweets from any Twitter feeds, right? And we can classify those tweets as positive or negative. So these positive or negative sentiment can be decided based on text classification approach. So let's say there is an input says, I really like the way you make us understand, right? So that sounds like a positive sentence. But if someone says this is so boring, so that's negative. So how do we actually come to that conclusion that a sentence is positive or negative? So let's understand from a human perspective. So we read each sentence, each word in a sentence, like I really like the way you make us understand. So we do not actually read half of the word from the sentence and make assumption that this is what it means. Probably we can predict that what would be the next sentence, right? But to understand the complete context, we read the whole sentence and then we understand what exactly it means. So then we can arrive at the conclusion that it is a positive or negative. Similarly, in neural network, we can have something called a state, right? So that state you will decide whether some data is positive, negative, spam or not spam or something like that. So those states are basically some vector numbers. So we can call them as a vector. So based on those vectors, we decide that this particular value is whatever we our business use case is. Okay. So another thing is image captioning, right? In image captioning, we use RNN LSTM. So this is a very interesting image though I have taken. If you have your breakfast, I think then good. Otherwise, it might remind you about that. So in an image for which we need a textual description, right? So say for example, now we have a single input image and a series of sequence of words that describes the image. So image might be a fixed size, let's say it can be variable size, but the output is a description of varying length, right? So the first one says oats and fiber, let's say, and the second one describes the image as a poached eggs on a avocado and feta toast, right? So this is the kind of describing that what kind of breakfast or what kind of uh, food item it is, right? So similarly, we can have any image that can have a varied description, varied length description talking about the image, right? So those things, the image captioning also can be done using RNN and LSTM, and it's a very useful technique, to approach through RNN or LSTM. So another important NLP task that is helpful. I mean, the RNN is basically useful is translating a particular language, let's say English to French, right? So each language has its own semantics and would have varying length for the same sentence. So here the input as well as the outputs are varying length, right? We can see here the input and the output is changing here, right? So they are of different lengths, right? So this is kind of that we need to understand, right? So the inputs are different for each of these translations. So similarly, that there are so many other tasks that we can perform in NLP using RNN or LSTM. So this is kind of an understanding of why RNN and what exactly RNN or LSTM is. Okay, so we'll go deeper into RNN first, and then we'll understand what exactly LSTM looks like. Okay, so a RNN model, basically by the name, if you understand, recurrent neural network is a natural generalization of feed-forward neural networks to sequences. So feed-forward is basically from one input to that sequence of inputs we pass in to a sequence of output. So we get sequence of output. So this is like here, this xi and yi, if you see here, or x0 or y0 in the image, right? So those are vectors and can have arbitrary dimensions. So these dimensions are based on your vocabulary size. Let's say I am feeding in a complete document, so my vocabulary size would be the number of words, unique words that I am passing in as an input, right? So RNNs work by iteratively updating a hidden state ht, which is a vector that can also have arbitrary dimension. So all of these layers that you see, the colors here, the different colors, right? So all of these are basically my constructing my RNN, and these are arbitrary dimensions. They are vectors and they are arbitrary dimensions. This is primary thing to understand. Another thing is the sequence of input, the x0, x1, x2, dot 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 xn will be going as an input to my ht, that's my hidden state or the layer, right? So there we have we pass in these input values and we get a predicted value y0, y1 and yn, right? So the predictions are based on what we pass in as an input. So the next hidden state ht is calculated using the previous hidden state, right? That's one thing that we need to understand. These hidden states are actually calculated based on what we sent as before the present state, right? So like that I was giving you an analogy that how we humans understand things. What happened in the past, we based on that we determine the present, right? We if we talk about RNN first, and then based on that we will understand LSTM while we understand while we are trying to see the architecture of LSTM. So something like that, there would be multiple analogies, but the primary concept here is to calculate the previous hidden state, and based on that you see the next hidden state. So here the inputs are basically given based on the states, and the next output is calculated based on the ht here, right? So ht is what? Ht is the hidden state, that is the next state of the previous state, right? So if I take that as an example, for here if you see, so what makes RNN recurrent, right? So it uses same weights for each step, and more specifically a typical vanilla RNN, right, uses 3 sets of weights. I mean, there could be multiple variations of RNN again, but let's talk about a vanilla RNN where we have 3 weights. So WXH, WHH, and this should be I'll update this one. So this should be YH. Okay. So XH used for XT and HT links, right? So we should see here these links. This is the link that we have, and then we have WHH used for HT minus 1 and HT. So there is a link between these states also, right? So there is a link between them. So that weight is basically calculated by WHH, and we have WYH, which is used for HT and YT. So which is you see here the HT and YT, this link. Okay. So these are the 3 sets of weights to perform the calculation, and we'll also use 2 biases for our RNN. The 2 biases are BH and BY, right? So BH is added when calculating HT, and BY is added when calculating YT. Okay, so these are the two biases that we have in RNN. Okay, so when we represent the weights as a matrix, right, and the biases as vectors, so weights as a matrix, biases as vectors. So these 3 weights and 2 biases makes up the entire RNN. So the entire RNN is made up of these 2 biases, BH and BY, and 3 weights. If you see here, WXH, WHH, and WYH. So very important to understand how these weights are actually being assigned and used in any neural network. So in RNN we have 3 weights and 2 biases, and the complete equation looks like this. So if you see the equation, ht equals to tan h of tan h is the activation function. So as this is a linear function, right? So you need to understand the basic concept of any neural network. where we use a linear function, but a linear function would not do anything, and we would not be able to process the input, we would not be able to get what we are expecting. So we apply non-linearity into the neural network. We bring in non-linearity. So these activation functions are very useful in those, basically making a linear function non-linear, right? So I would not cover the activation functions that in this session, though. Just to have an idea, tanh, softmax, and there are so many other like sigmoid functions are there, so which we use as a activation function for making a linear function non-linear. Okay, and then finally we have a yt as an output where we use wyh, right, into ht plus the bias. So first thing is ht. We have that ht calculated based on what? Based on the input that we give. So xt is the input and the weight of that, and we have the previous state, hidden state, that is whh. The weight of that is whh, and we have a bias. So this is what my equation is, ht and yt, right? So all the weights are applied using matrix multiplication. So we do a multiplication here, the matrix multiplication, right? So if you see here, the bias is as a vector and the weights as a matrix, and we calculate that by multiplying and doing addition. So a simple linear equation applied with the tan h activation function on top of that, and we get the ht. So this is the resulting the product. So we then use tan h and activation function and for the first equation, but other activations like sigmoid can also be used. That's what I mentioned, right? So this is up to our choice. So but remember, these tan h sigmoid functions or ReLU functions make a huge difference in the outputs that we calculate in any neural network after applying on a linear function, right? So to introduce non-linearity, we bring in these activation functions. Let's understand same concept with an example. So let's say when we read a sentence, we don't usually read individual words, right, in isolation and remember them first. So what we do is we actually read the individual words in isolation and remember them first, then move on to figuring out what the sentence means. What we do is we usually scan the sentence from beginning, right? We do not, that's what I was talking about, and one word at a time while holding what the partial sentence means up until the part of you are reading in your short term memory, right? So you remember what we have. Let's say there is a whole sentence, you read till that, and then you remember what exactly that means, and then you read the next word, and then you actually understand till that what it means, and again then the whole sentence you read and then you understand. So this is basically we can call it as a short term memory. We use basically we usually scan the sentence from the beginning, one word at a time, while holding what the partial sentence means up until the part you are reading, right? So in other words, you maintain some sort of mental representation of the sentence while you read it, right? So while we are reading that, we actually have that idea of that, okay, this till this what it actually means. There is a mental representation. So when you reach the end of the sentence, the mental representation is its meaning. So when you reach here, you actually get the meaning of the complete sentence. This is how a human brain works, right? How we understand a sentence. Now if you break down the reading process mentioned above, it is basically the core repeating of the following operations. Let's say the reading a word first, then based on what has been read so far, like your mental state, figure out what the word means. Okay, that's the second. Third is update the mental state, and fourth is move on to the next word. So this is what exactly the sequence comes in when you understand a particular sentence, right? Let's use this technique for implementing our RNN. So once we understand how the sequences are, how first is reading a word based on what has been read so far. Basically once your mental state is created based on what you read, then figure out what the word means, and then update the mental state. You update the mental state by each word, right? And then move to the next word. Okay, so again, so that's kind of like your short term memory that helps you keep that meaning, and then you add the second word, and then you come to another meaning, right? So that's how the complete sentence actually ends, and you get the whole meaning of the sentence. So if we take that as an example, let's see that how this works, right? So input sentence is, let's say, John loves Mary, right? So, and each word is already represented as a word embedding vector. So also let's denote your mental state as a state. For example, this is a state which is initialized by init state, for example. Then the reading process is represented by the following incremental operation, right? So what would be that? First is your the mental state, that is init state, and then what happens, you update. So first you read John, okay, and then second state you update loves, and then in the other state, then again you update Mary, right? And then finally you end the sentence with a dot. The dot represents, let's say, that is the end of the sentence, right? So this is how the state should be, the code or implementation should be for a sentence like this. Okay, so once we go ahead with that, the final value of state becomes the representation of entire sentence from this process, right? So that gives us the meaning of the entire sentence, right? So that's very important to understand. So if you notice here, right, if you change the order in which these words are processed, for example, by flipping John and Mary, the final value of state will also change, right? Meaning that the state also encodes some information about the word order, right? So that word order or the sequence, that matters. The sequence matters here. So you can achieve something similar if you can design a network or substructure that is applied to each element of the input while updating some internal state. So that is something very important. So RNNs are neural network structures that do exactly this. What do we do here? We get the state, we count, we check all the words, we update the words, and we get the state. So if you see, this code is very simple, right? That defines my RNN. For example, I have a initial init state. I define the init state by a state equals to init state variable, and I run a for loop of all the words. Let's say John, Mary, and loves, right? So, and I update those state by the word by state, right? So I update the init state by the next word, and so on, and then we return the state. So RNNs are neural network structure that do exactly this. In a nutshell, a RNN is a neural network with a loop. So in simplified terms, I can say its RNN is nothing but a loop, a neural network with a loop. And so at its core is an operation that gets applied to every element in the input as they come in. So if you wrote what RNNs do in pseudo Python, it would be like what you see here, right? So now let's say we implement the whole RNN with a simple data set. So the sample data set, before that, let's understand a quick, it's just a quick recap of linear layers or linear functions, right? So linear layers transforms a vector to another vector in a linear fashion. But how exactly do they do this? If you see the function here, wx plus b, right? A linear function wx plus b. So that means basically we always change the output by a fixed amount, let's say w, right? So if you change the input by 1, no matter what the value of input is, we will have always the same the w is actually fixed, right? That's my weight. So if you see in our previous equations where we calculated ht equals to w xh into x, right, plus whh into ht minus 1 plus bias, right? So that was my primary equation. Similar to this linear equation, they look exactly similar, except let's say I can have multiple inputs, right? So if you see here, the 2.0 into, let's say the value of w is 2.0, the weight is 2.0 in a linear function. So the value always increases by 2.0, right? That's kind of the thing that makes a function linear, right? So if you increase x by 1, no matter what the value of x is, it will be always incremented by 2.0. So a function in Python, it looks like this, right? Define linear, return w into x plus b. If I have multiple like two input variables, it will look like w into x plus w2 into x2 plus b. Okay, this is a quick recap of a linear function. Next, based on these, now we'll understand the next thing. So with RNN, we have an initial state, right? So getting the context, getting the beginning of the sentence, beginning of the word, then you get John, and then loves, you update it, and then you pass Mary and update it, and then you pass a dot, basically end of the sentence, and then you update. So you get the final state. This is what the diagram would look like, right, in implementing RNN. So when you are reading a sentence, what happens? So sequence of words, your internal mental representation of the sentence, and the state gets updated after reading each word, right? So I have taken a train data and a test data, something like this. Let's say this was bad earlier, which is my train data, where exactly I have labeled them as a false and true or false, and based on that I will predict if a sentence is true or false, right? So I will train the model with a test data, and final output would be my any input that I give as an example. Let's say that is not so bad, so will that be able to predict or not? We can make the RN work like that. Okay, so that's kind of an example that we can take. So let's say so your internal mental representation of the sentence and state gets updated after reading each word, right? So you can assume that the final state encodes the representation of the entire sentence. So the only remaining work is to design two functions. One is init state and update. So the state is usually initialized with a 0, that is a vector filled with zeros, right? So how does it know what would be my initial state, right? So if you see here, so that there I don't have any word, right? So it has to be initialized, the neural network has to be initialized with something, because when I go when I start with John, right? So before John there should be some initialization, that's why. So the state is usually initialized with 0, and that is a vector filled with zeros. So basically a vector that can have zeros, right? That can have zeros. So that's what initialized with zeros. So you usually don't have to worry about how to go about defining the former. So that's kind of already decided. The more important is how you design update, which determines the characteristics of RNN. So update is the thing that we have to take care. What would be the update? The update would be W1 into state and W2 into word plus bias. So similar to linear function, we can implement update, right? This also looks like a similar, nothing but a linear function. There is no difference from a linear function, except like, I mean, you can say two variable linear function, which is basically a function that takes two input variables and produces one output variable. After all, a cell is neural network with its own input and output. So here each cell, right? If you see here, I can say this is my cell, this is another cell, this is another cell, this is another cell, right? So each cell is basically a having its own input and output. So the similar linear function we observed in the recap section, if you see, so if we ignore the difference, right, in variable names, it exactly same except the function. And a RNN defined by type of this type of update function is called a simple RNN or element RNN or vanilla RNN, whatever. And as its name suggests, one of the simplest RNN structures are like this. Okay, so this is very simple to implement as well. So implementing the RNN module, if you see here, like we will have to do some pre-processing before we do that, to get the data into usable format for RNN, And to start, we will construct a vocabulary of all words that exist in our data. So for example, we import these numpy library, and then we import RNN, which I already defined. So I will show that function, I mean the class. And then we have the vocabulary list. So we read all the words from the vocabulary, because we basically pass in each word, right? That's what you understand here, why we need to read from vocabulary. And then we assign the indices to each word, right? So we need to have an index for all of these words. And next is we have to define the input function. What is that? So it so that's what the input goes in. So I mean, after that we apply a softmax function on top of that. Okay. So let's go to the next. So then we have a forward phase, right? So forward phase would be again that passing into the next layer and so on. So while implementing the actual RNN module, we will start by initializing 3 weights and 2 biases that we have seen in the equation. That's the primary equation of RNN, and we are dividing by 1000. If you see here, right, that's my RNN class, and a vanilla RNN, right? So in that I have input size and output size, and I have defined the hidden states. Let's say hidden state size is 64. So the weights are basically WHH, WXH, and WHY. That's what we saw earlier. And we have a randomized hidden state, and divide 1000 each of them, and then we have a bias, right? So the weights and bias, these are the two things that actually make the complete RNN, right? So we are dividing by 1000 to reduce the initial variance of our weight. So this is not the best way to initialize weights, but it's simple and works for this particular uh, post. So I would say any of these examples that you actually work on, it's up to you that how you are going to define these particular models, right? So in NP, random function is to initialize our weights from the standard normal distribution. So NP random state, we actually get it from as a random state, so we can define that also in the RNN module implementation. Okay. So next is like based on equations we defined earlier, right? So ht and yt. So we can note that we initialized h to the 0 vector for the first step, and since there is no previous h, we can use at the we use at that by basically at that point, right? So h is here, if you see here that we have a h defined. So perform for like a forward pass of RNN using the given input, and input is as an array of one hot vectors, right? So that we actually already did that. We make those words as an one hot vector input, and we pass that into our function, right? Enumerate function. So if you see here, np.tanh self dot wxh, we already defined self dot whh plus the bias, right? So this is the forward pass that goes in to my implementation. Okay. All right. So then we have to train the model, and then we get the output. So that's kind of a complete RNN module that you can implement based on that. But training and defining the back propagation is one of the important tasks in any neural network based models training, where you need to understand why we do back propagation, to understand or to basically train the weights in backward way. So I will not cover that mathematical function and the derivations of BPTT, but it is something that you should be understanding from any neural network basics. So, but for calculating the loss, in order to train our RNN, we first need a loss function, right? So while we train, we have to know the cross entropy loss. That is something that we use in RNN. So which is often paired with a softmax. So let's say if we have something a cross entropy loss function with PC is our RNN predicted probability, right? So for correct class, positive or negative, we have a predicted probability PC. So if we take the text, right, so where the predicted text is 90% positive for RNN, the loss would be the function you pass into the PC, right? That's basically 10%, right? So once we have that loss, we can train our RNN using gradient descent to minimize the loss. So we basically use that back propagation technique to minimize the loss of our network, okay, RNN network. All right. So now we understood, let's say, train the model and we got the output. We have the loss calculated, and finally we got our neural network trained and got the output. But the problem with simple RNNs that we discussed in this, right? In real world NLP applications, due to vanishing gradient problem, we cannot use RNN. So that's one of the very important aspect of it, that it doesn't solve this problem of vanishing gradient. So what that problem actually, will understand that. So just like any programming language, if you know the length of the input, you can write a loop without using any loop, right? So for example, here, let's say I have defined RNN as a function, and I pass in the sentences, and you pass in each of the word as a sentence value, right? And then you initialize that and state, and then you pass in the state along with the word and the previous word and basically the next word and the next word and the next word, right? And then you finally get the state. So that's basically kind of a loop that we follow. So an RNN can also be rewritten without using a loop, and which makes it look like a regular neural network with many layers, right? So for example, if you know that there is only 6 words in the input, RNN above can be written as like this, right? So because I know already I have 6 words. But representing RNNs without loops is called unrolling. So now we know what update looks like for a simple RNN, and we can replace that function call with their bodies basically, right? So the function would be looking like this, right? I have a sentence and I have a init state, and the state will have f of w1 into f of w1 into f of w1 into f of w1, something like this. And then you have all the words, and then you again pass in the state of w1 into w2 into word 1 plus b. So it looks very messy, right? And very bad implementation. What happens with that is these nested function calls and multiplications actually causes a RN to go into vanishing gradient problem, bring in the vanishing gradient problem. So let's say if I have an input like the books I read yesterday, where in this case the innermost function call process the first word, and the next one processes the second word, books, and so on. So all the way around almost to the where, right? That's what we do. Now if I implement that complete function, it would be like state and then process the main verb. That's my function, let's say, defined with w1 into process adverb, then w1 into process relative clause verb, w1 into process relative clause subject, w1 into process main subject, then inside that again w1 into, so it's a very you go in depth, in depth, and in depth, right, for each word, right, and then you finally get the state. So if you rewrite this pseudocode what we did here, you can understand it's more intuitive and it's very complex, and it is making the network to basically uh, go slow and very diluted, right. So that's not making bringing the previous state, which is very important. Like when we understand any RNN, what was the main purpose is to read each word, and then we add that the next word as an update, then next word as an update, and next word as an update. But if this is what the function goes in, it is going to lose a lot of information, right. So the nested function calls repeat this process and plays a, basically we can call it as a telephone game until the message reaches the innermost function. So by that time you call, and then other from the other end it calls back, so that's we call back propagation. So in a telephone game, let's say, so by that time, because the message needs to pass through many layers, it becomes so weak and obscure, or so strong and skewed because of some misunderstanding, so that the inner function have a difficult time to figure out what they did wrong. So that is kind of a problem that brings in with RNN, and technically this is called vanishing gradient problem, right, in deep learning literature. So I think that gives you an idea of what exactly the RNN has problem that brings in with its simplicity, right? And how do we solve that? So we have a new model or concept called long short-term memory, LSTM, right? By the name, if you understand, it's basically a long short-term memory. So it helps you keep the things or the information intact. So we bring in a new variable in this with a LSTM, right? So the new variable helps you get the context, or basically get the state of those words, right? So you do not lose the information here. So like I said, the way nested function mentioned above process information about the grammar seems too inefficient. So why doesn't what we do is, why doesn't the outermost function, what we can actually think of, let's say the outermost function, which is grammatical, right? So what we have here, let's say is grammatical is the function, right? So let's say this is my outermost function. Why doesn't the outermost function uh, tell the particular function in charge? So the particular function in charge is the process main verb, right? That is one of my function that goes, that takes the states. So tell the outermost the function, I mean basically tell the function in charge for process main subject what went wrong directly. So instead of playing the telephone game, so that is something you can say they cannot, because the message can change its shape entirely after each function call because of w2 and the function. So the outermost function cannot tell which function was responsible for which part of the message only from the final output. That is not possible, because the outermost function actually doesn't have that information carrying forward. So LSTM is actually solving this problem. The LSTM states are comprised of two halves. So what we do is we actually divide these cells as a two half, that is the memory part and the hidden state, right? The mental representation part. So like earlier we had a simple RNN cell, right? So we did not have, I mean basically we had only state, but now we have two parts of this cell. One part, that is the memory part, and the other one is the mental representation part. So this is what we had earlier. Now we have something called ct minus 1. What does it do? That the function forget returns a value, so between 0 and 1. So multiplying by this number means erasing old memory from cell state. So we have some options called like erasing the old memory, right? So how much to erase is determined from a hidden state and word input. So based on the word input we actually decide how much, and based on the hidden state we decide how much to erase. So controlling the flow of information by multiplying by a value between 0 and 1 is called gating. So this is that's where we actually apply some gating mechanism here, and this is in LSTM we first introduced this getting technique, right? So this is where we actually controlling the flow of information. We know how much to pass into the hidden state, how much is to erase from the input. Okay, so that this technique is called basically getting. And what we do in this process is to we control the flow of information by multiplying a value between 0 and 1. Okay. Okay. So instead of LSTM helps in solving that inefficiency of RNN, right? So instead of passing the information through an activation function every time every time and changing its shape completely, what we do is adding subtracting information relevant to the part of the sentence. So we do not basically based on each step we add or subtract information from the sentence, right? So that's what actually helps in succeeding or solving that problem with LSTM, right? Solving the problem with the RNN that we observed as a vanishing gradient problem. Okay. So let's take the whole understanding of LSTM that solves the problem with an example, right? So if process main subject, right, can directly add information about the subject to some type of memory, and the network can make sure the memory passes through the intermediate functions intact, like the is grammatical is our outer function, right? We'll have a much easier time telling the previous function what to do in order to adjust its output. So that's kind of the thing that we bring in with LSTM, and that solves that problem of losing the information, right? So so what we do here is, first thing is, LSTMs are the first RNN architecture that uses this getting mechanism I was telling. So the function add returns a new value added to the memory. We'll see these things. So the value again is determined from hidden state and word. Finally, hidden state is updated using a function whose value is computed from the previous hidden state and the updated memory and the input word. So we need to understand these things. That first is the function add returns the new value added to the memory. We need to have that, right? And the value again is determined from hidden state and the word. So there are two things. One is the add function that returns the new value added to the memory. Another thing is the value that comes in, that determines from the hidden state and the word. So finally, hidden state is updated using a function whose value is computed from previous hidden state, the updated memory and the input word. So we'll see that in the function. So because LSTMs have these cell state that stays constant across different time steps. So if you see here the cell state, right? So that that cell state is basically constant over the complete time step. Whatever happens in complete time step, it will be constant. Okay, so that something that helps, right? So this constant state of the cell uh, uh, I mean computed to the previous state and updated memory with the input word. So because LSTM have this cell state that stays constant across different time steps, unless explicitly modified, they are easier to train and relatively well behaved. So that is kind of one information that helps us, that helps us to take the information forward with the cell. And because you have a shared memory and functions are adding and removing information related to different parts of the input sentence, it is easier to pinpoint which function did what and what went wrong. That was not available in the RNN earlier, right? So if you understand the code in RNN that I've displayed, that there was no way that we can actually capture those information. So in RNN, what we do is we actually get that information in a getting mechanism, and we basically call that as 0 or 1, and that value is passed in as an or added layer to the network that help us understand what went wrong and what exactly the information comes in from the network, right? So that is this one is an example from NLP, though it's not very simplified. It looks complicated. With LSTM it becomes little complicated. So if you see the previous example, I'm not sure if I take the code. So that so that's kind of this is an example that I have for now. So you can see this in LSTM, that we get the previous state, and then we solve that problem of inefficiency through these applying the gate function in the LSTM. Okay, yeah, so that's all from my side for today. Any questions, you can go ahead.
So you don't have any other?
No, I don't have any other code for now. I have a simple, I mean, there are 2-3 cells only, so it's not required to run it in a notebook. But yeah, I don't have any separate code for. I displayed everything what we had.
Okay, so any other questions, audience? There's some good appreciation coming.
Thank you.
So the PowerPoint is part of our course series, so PowerPoint cannot be shared. We'll be launching this NLP course in later part of June. So the video recordings will be available for our NLP course participants, along with code demos as well. If you join our Prime program, you can get access to today's recording. Any other questions, audience? Okay, so we don't see any further questions. Lots of good words coming in on the chat. Thank you all. Thanks a lot, Indrajit. Really good content and explanation. And look forward to your future sessions.
Thank you, Vivek. Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks, everyone.